All right. Hello, Red Team Village. Welcome to a case study that we call Project Motorhead. I'm Bryson Bort. I am the founder and CEO of Scythe.
And I am Jorge Orchilles. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Scythe.
We put this presentation together for a couple of reasons. And one of the things I think is so interesting about it is that Purple Team is just a different version of red teaming that's evolved to focus more on the business and real-time results. And the challenge that we have so often in this industry is sharing explicit details so that folks get beyond the, okay, that's a process or that's some new process. What does it actually mean? What does it actually look like? And what kinds of things do I really get out of it? And in this case, we did a case study with the National Motor Freight Traffic Association that puts that all together. And we want to give a big shout out to them and the head of IT over there, Urban Johnson, for allowing us to come in, spend a couple of months working with them and sharing this information with you. Agenda. We're going to go through essentially the Purple Team process, only this time we're going to be sharing exactly what happened so you can see for yourself what works. You'll notice the link there. That goes to our excellent Purple Team exercise framework. It's a free document that gives you lots of considerations and details for more of a deep dive on the process side. All of our slides that have sources and references will provide links like that to allow you to deep dive on your own to go in more detail after the presentation.
Yep, and the agenda here is pretty much following the Purple Team exercise framework because that is exactly what we did for about a 2-month period. And you can see there, and something we'll definitely talk about, cyber threat intelligence does play a role. A lot of people think purple teaming is only red and blue, but we actually start with cyber threat intelligence so that we can identify adversaries that have the opportunity, intent, and capability to attack a target organization. We understand their behaviors, and then we prepare a plan around those behaviors. So again, shout out to NMFTA for allowing us to share what we did there. It's not often that companies let you do that and give back to the community. So appreciate that.
So this was a 2-month exercise with 6 weeks of hands-on with the organization. A Purple Team is essentially a collaborative red team where we're adding the threat intelligence to make sure that we're emulating specific adversaries and behaviors. Just like threat hunting, those essentially provide the hypothesis for how to look at our defense. And then, of course, the blue team and response side that's there to actually make the improvements. In this case, our company was hired to do all of the roles. So we provided the threats, we pulled them together, and then we helped implement the defenses. With the caveat, we're not going to spend anything new on technology. This shouldn't be a surprise to many folks that a lot of technology is underutilized that's in the environment. And then that it's not that defensive technologies don't work so much as you have to tune them in for your environment to make sure that they're detecting and responding with your personnel as you're going.
Yeah, and that part should not be overlooked. I worked for 10 years at a large financial. About 4 years ago, we realized that we had around 130 security products deployed in the environment. And when we looked at those from the red team perspective before we started doing purple teaming, we found that we were using about 10% of the capability of each one. So at that point, our head of security said, enough spending, let's actually work, let's train people, let's put people in process together to work together and be able to tune these so that we get more bang for our buck, especially when you're spending a ton of money on these products, only using 10%. Does not sound like it's bringing the most business value, and that's something we're going to focus on here.
So what did we do? Over those 6 weeks, we start with a baseline. And the key thing to understanding a baseline and the approach here is you're not trying to get to 100%. One, there's no such thing. And two, even if you hit what looks like a nominal 100% in your rankings, that's a false sense of security. The idea is understanding a relative baseline of what's that appropriate percentage and how you're performing to it and maintaining that. So we establish that baseline, And then we went through an increasing sophistication of APT actors from the standard threats of the Iranians, the Chinese, and the Russians. And finally, in week 6, it's noted as free play. And this is not the traditional, hey, just do anything to win perspective to the red team. But the free play was more of where can we dial in based on what we've seen here over the past month to flex areas that we think are still open. So threat detection is hard. If it were easy, we'd all be doing it and we wouldn't have to be doing these things. And there's 3 reasons that it's difficult. And this comes from Anton Chuvakin, former Gartner analyst. I believe he's now at Google. And he talks about that, first of all, the uncertainty of being able to detect a threat is that, of course, attackers change. In a couple of slides here, we'll show the standard pyramid of pain by David Bianco. And the idea being there is it's really easy to signature. It's really hard to TTP. And the attacker is always changing that whole stack because it doesn't cost a lot for them to be able to do that. The second is that we need to be improving detection through alerting. Today, we're awash in alerts. Tuning allows us to bring that down into specifically what's of interest to us. And then that multi-stage detection is the fact that this is why a lot of solutions on the market struggle to give strong detection that lasts. Is it's not a checklist. It's contextual. And what that means is once an attacker has gained access in the way that they're moving toward your crown jewels of interest, all of those behaviors are in context. They're state-based. For example, employees and folks take screenshots all the time. I can't think of a single day that I'm not taking a screenshot on my computer. The context of taking that screenshot when I'm doing that to remember something versus an attacker doing that to steal credentials and being able to tie those activities to a host, to hosts and network activities gives the context to be able to dial in the detection. The second part of this is the cyber defense matrix that was revealed a few years ago by Sunil Yu. This is a fantastic way to look at the phases and different categories of your defense. So from devices to users, identification is configuration management, knowing what I have. And then we move into the real defensive parts with protection, my ability to harden my systems, detection, which we're talking about, which is my ability to see a threat, respond to the threat, and then recover. And so what we're doing here is we are kind of dialing in focus on that detection, but in the process of a proper purple team exercise, we're also going to be able to get elements of protect and respond. So I'm a former Army officer, and I like to keep everything simple. You've seen the kill chain, you've seen MITRE ATT&CK, you've seen all of these different ways of describing what an attack chain is. And I like to describe it very simply. There are 3 phases. Recon, the adversary is gaining intelligence about you for conducting the attack. Access, their ability to get into a system. And then post-access, which is where most of that context that we were just talking about comes into play. Recon, I haven't done anything to you yet. Access, I've got shell. I'm in your perimeter, but I haven't done anything yet. Post-access is where we're actually going to be seeing the potential to what's going to happen to me. In this scenario, we were instructed to go with an assumed breach. Urban was confident with the amount of surface area access that he looked at, that he really wanted to spend more of his time focused on that business value of what happens next and being able to dial in.
Yep. And with that in mind, we'll wrap up our executive summary here, just a summary of what we're going to dive into in this next 50 minutes or so. And that is where we were when we got there and where we were when we left. So based on this assumed breach and the adversaries we emulated, 94% of those adversary behaviors were undetected. 3 test cases were detected, which was great. We obviously show the wins as well. This was related to scheduled tasks being created in the environment. They were something that you can obviously do. And in this case, it was detected. and then one test case blocked related to DNS command and control, which we'll dive into deeper. So the baseline result here was that these known threats had the ability to achieve their objective in this environment without being detected. Now, after 6 weeks and $0 technology spend, we were able to achieve a 64% detection rate on these adversary behaviors. We did that by enabling telemetry. We used Sysmon, and we created rules, logic, and alerts on their SIM, which they use a tool called Event Sentry, and that really helped us be able to create these rules much quicker. So we focused on creating detections locally, then sending them to a central log aggregator, have some security analytics occur there, and then based on those rules and alerts and context, alert the team within here. And the end result was that these known threats would be detected now in various places of that attack chain before achieving their objective. So with that, we're going to jump into our the meat of our presentation. Hopefully you're all still with us, and this is exciting stuff. And of course, we're going to get more technical. So again, from the highest of levels, the goals and objectives here were to measure how and if the organization would be able to detect and respond to a known adversary that had the opportunity, intent, and capability to attack them. We did the whole cyber threat intelligence part. We analyzed the organization, identified adversaries, etc., and we created adversary emulation plans. Now, it's important to note that these adversary emulation plans that we created are being shared with the community. At the end of this, we have slides for all of those resources. So a lot of nice resources for you to leverage. Then we emulated the adversary against the production environment. We turned on telemetry, we tuned it, and we've created rules and alerts that are also going to be given back to the community if you use things like Sysmon or Event Sentry. Those are all going to be out there. And of course, $0 spend in technology. The technology was already there. Sure, we identified gaps where there wasn't. We'll talk about that towards the end, but we still achieved that 64% detection rate without ever buying a new product. So when we talk about cyber threat intelligence, we're not talking about indicators of compromise. A lot of people think that cyber threat intelligence is just a list of IOCs and bad IP addresses and bad hash values and whatnot. In this case, we want to focus on adversary behaviors. So we had to understand the target organization. In this case, the target organization had already done and does vulnerability scanning, vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, and yearly red team engagements. So we had a good understanding there of the previous results, of what they found. And of course, we worked closely with the organization, right? This was not a blind type of test where we're going in with zero knowledge. We want to know as much as possible, again, to bring the most business value. We then, based on this organization, the National Motor Freight Traffic Association, identified adversaries that have attacked organizations in that region and in that industry so that we can then gather threat intelligence and really understand the behaviors. Of course, we got a lot of IOCs in that threat intelligence. We leveraged those a little bit. We'll talk about that. But really, we wanted to focus on the behaviors themselves. These are known as TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Of course, we map this back to MITRE ATT&CK, and we create and analyze and organize them into a MITRE ATT&CK heat map. That allows us to then create a plan. Most of the time, you don't start with initial access, right? You generally have to do some recon, build out some attack infrastructure, then set up command and control, and then you jump to these, right? So looking at something like MITRE ATT&CK, you're not actually going left to right. You need to analyze and really create a plan around that. So we created these plans. And again, we have the largest library of publicly available adversary emulation plans, which we'll give you here at the end. A lot based on this research and giving back to the community, of course. So how did a purple team exercise flow work? Well, the beginning of each week, we would meet on Monday with all involved, and we'll go over roles and responsibilities shortly. But everyone involved, we'd have a meeting early on the first day of the week, and we would cover the particular adversary that we were going to emulate. We covered their behaviors. We covered the technical details. This way, everyone's learning. Then we thought about it. We did a little tabletop discussion. Again, it was assumed breach, so things around phishing and gaining initial access through various methods, we would just tabletop that. And then when we talked about the actual behaviors, where we thought there'd be detection for, so I mentioned earlier, scheduled tasks. Scheduled tasks, they believed that they had blocked or that they would be able to detect it. And in that case, when we emulated the TTP here on step 3, we actually were able to verify that. But there were some assumptions that were made that weren't true, and that was important to catch, as well as assumptions that were true, and they indeed did or did not have detections for those. So we emulate those TTPs, and then we, as also playing the role of the blue team, of course, this was a number of people, we would perform that work, right? Doing the hunting, seeing if there's anything, any logs locally, seeing if there was anything in the SIM, seeing all the security consoles that this organization used to see if there was any sign, any log of this activity. And then we would share that and say, look, this was caught over here, this was caught over there. We need to get all that together, create some context around it, and then make the controls better. So we performed a lot of adjustments over this week-long period, repeating the same TTPs over and over. So when we would turn on, say, local logging, we'd repeat the TTP to make sure that it was logged locally. Then when we would send it to the SIM, we'd repeat it. Then we would create logic, would repeat it. So a lot of repeating. As we go through here, you're going to see why it's extremely important that you have a tool set that allows you to consistently and reliably emulate these adversary behaviors. And then, of course, at the end, there's always going to be things that you won't be able to fix given the constraints that you are given. So we document those and have those as action items and lessons learned. So what do I mean when I say TTPs? Those are adversary behaviors. And here's another example of us giving references, right? We did not make all this up. This is David Bianco, who is a SANS instructor in the DFIR curriculum. That's for digital forensics and incident response. And way back in 2013, came out with the pyramid of pain. I'm sure you've seen this before. And it's really for defenders, stating that gaining hash values of a known bad is very easy to block, right? That's what antivirus does. Or getting an IP address or a domain name that has been seen and has the reputation of doing malicious things. It's simple and relatively easy to block that. But as you get up towards the pyramid, when we start talking about network and host artifacts, like creating a scheduled task, messing with the registry, things like that, or sending traffic out, right? Sending heartbeats out to a command and control. Those are a lot harder to catch. And then based on the tool set, it gets even more challenging. But really the toughest one to get and to catch are the adversary behaviors themselves. And this is what we want to focus on. For an organization that already does vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, red teaming once a year, they're at a maturity level where we can focus on these behaviors, which are the toughest ones to catch. And that's what we focus on. So jumping back, again, shout out to Anton from Google, used to be at Gartner. Excellent blog, right? So the reference is down here. And this is very, very recent, probably published this maybe a week, 2 weeks ago. And the blog is titled, Why is Detection Hard? And I took a couple of main points out of this that we see all the time with all of our customers, right? And that is that today's environments are complex and messy. They are growing, right? They started maybe 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, and then they migrate to a new version of Active Directory or new servers, or they do merger and acquisitions where they acquire or merge with another company, and then they merge all that IT together. And none of this is very well documented, right? Things are kind of done quickly, cut to enable the business to be able to operate. So I think we can all agree most environments are pretty complex and messy. The next part is that detection needs people. You have some sort of detection, you enable some sort of detection somewhere, but you still need the people to actually create it. And people don't scale well, right? The next part is that detection needs data. And data can come from a ton of sources. When we got to Motorhead, there were a lot of sources. There was security consoles here, firewalls over there, antivirus over there, a SIM over there, email security over there. You have all these sources, and those are owned by people. And you have to create context around it. A particular attack isn't only going to have a source of, a firewall connection or a network connection going out. There's going to be something on the endpoint as well. Right? So all of that needs the context, and it needs to get triaged. So really creating the rules and the logic is probably where we spent the most amount of time. I would say around 60 to 70% of our time throughout this entire exercise was focused on the triaging of the rules and the logic. So we'd have a number of logs all over the place, bringing them together, putting the context together, triaging those, and alerting. And all this gets more complicated with attackers not wanting to be detected, right? With the exception of ransomware that obviously does want to get detected because they want to get paid, or extortion. But most of the time, all of that occurs towards the end of the attack, towards the latter part of the kill chain. During most of the attack chain, attackers don't want to get caught because they want to get to their objective. And lastly, detection is about intent, not only activity. As Bryson mentioned, he takes screenshots all the time. How do you know when it's a good screenshot, and how do you know when it's a bad screenshot, right? So all of that and the intent really plays a big difference in detection. That makes detection really hard. Anton has published a couple other posts after this one, so another big shout out to that, and definitely check out his blog. So roles and responsibilities, right? At a high level, we had cyber threat intelligence, red team, blue team, and exercise coordinator and internal operations. So starting from the bottom up, internal operations were an MFTA, or what we call Motorhead. It's the code name for this organization. They're the sponsors. They're the ones that came to us, and they helped us do preparation, which I'm going to cover shortly, right? Provide an environment where we can do this testing. We did do all of this in production, so that's also an important part here. And they were spectators. They would be in on our meetings, our tabletops, and then as we would do things, they would be watching and also helping in remediation. And then again, we did the cyber threat intelligence. I went through that process already. We did that for 4 threat actors, which we'll jump into more here. Then the red team operators, we had folks from Scythe playing the red team. They used the Scythe platform, which I'll cover shortly. Then we had blue teamers. So this is, again, where we spent the most of the time, where we had multiple people working that role of enabling detection, creating logic, etc. And then exercise coordinator was played by me. I was the main point of contact throughout this exercise, making sure that the cyber threat intelligence was coming in, that it made sense for this organization, creating the adversary emulation plans, making sure the red team was executing them correctly, making sure the blue team was making progress as we went through. So very important when you put together these exercises to have a coordinator. It's a tough role, and make sure that that role isn't also the role of any of the others, right? You want this person generally to be able to communicate effectively with all the teams and understand the roles of all the teams. So from the red team side and the planning perspective, we created the attack infrastructure. And this was done by our red team operator. Generally, you have red teams, you have folks dedicated to attack infrastructure based on what you're trying to build. In this case, we leverage Scythe, which is our platform. It is an enterprise-grade command and control framework, but also has automation. So you can actually take these adversary emulation plans, all these behaviors, and put them in an attack chain while creating a particular binary that is custom, controlled by you, and pretty much synthetic malware that anytime you execute it will consistently run the same adversary behaviors over and over. So we set this up in Google Cloud Platform. You can set it up anywhere where you can install a Windows server. So it could have been Azure, could have been AWS, could have been anywhere there. We also set this up internally to have an internal server as well, an internal attack server. Then from the blue team side and the production side, we got a number of production systems. It's very important to do these tests in production because that's where all the real security tools are. Right? We go into non-production environments all the time. People use Scythe to test various defensive tools, and they'll try this in a lab. And when you turn that tool on at 100%, it should catch all these adversary behaviors, right? It should be the key word. However, in production, you can't realistically turn everything on. We've seen this time and again. You see it in a lab, you see how awesome it is, you turn it on in production and it breaks things. And then that's how you end up using only 10% of the product. So testing this in production really allows you to be able to tune around that context. What is good, what is bad, and only alert on the bad. So we got a number of hosts, just like a new user would. So we said set up a brand new user account, just like you hired a new employee. So we got a number of Windows 10 endpoints, one that was just a jump point. This is when you VPN into the environment, have this as your main jump point. And we didn't do much testing on that. We then had a system where we had admin access to. This was going to be where we made our modifications locally. Things like installing Sysmon and enabling certain controls were all done on this system. And then, of course, we had a baseline system. We wanted a system that was the entire time like the one that we arrived on, how we saw the systems when we first arrived. And then, of course, a server. And this is because in most mature organizations, you're going to have endpoints and servers with different security policies. And that was the case here. It was all managed by group policy. We'll talk a little bit about Active Directory, but you'll see that you'll definitely want a server there. And again, with a standard user. Most of everything that we want to do was as a standard user because that is what's happening. It's standard users getting compromised with that privilege and then those behaviors occurring, right? Running and doing this with local admin privileges doesn't really emulate really what happens in an engagement. And then we had an Active Directory account, we enabled email, and we got access to all the security controls. So without naming many names, your standard antivirus consoles, your firewalls, your SIM. In this case, they used Event Sentry, and we have permission to use that and talk about them because they really facilitated the blue team aspect of this. It really allowed us to create the alerting more efficiently. And then email security, great email security in this organization was something that we weren't mainly targeting, but we wanted to take a look and see what organizations are doing to protect that incoming initial access, right? So week one was baselining. So since we were playing both the blue team and the red team, we wanted to make sure that we had situational awareness. So we did a very basic test. On the red team side, we created a basic synthetic malware that could be executed either by double clicking the binary as an executable and through run DLL32. So this is a standard method of loading dynamic link libraries, DLLs, and we can create malicious ones that connect out to our command and control over the internet. And we did basic channel, the most common, right, based on threat intelligence, is HTTPS. Pretty much every organization allows that outbound. So we had a high hope that this would work. And then once we got a shell, we did the most basic thing that everyone does, right, is run Who Am I? To gain some situational awareness, right? That's your first discovery tactic. From the blue team side, we want to make sure we had visibility. We want to make sure that that particular endpoint was logging something to the extent then that we had access to it, that we can enable other logs if they weren't, that we were sending logs to the SIM, to Event Sentry, and to see if there was any alerts and logic around that. So we present this on week 1, and you'll see these graphical representations because you don't know your audience. You might have executives on there that are not going to understand the TTP level. Maybe they'll understand this higher level of defense evasion, command and control, discovery and execution, right? That's mapped to MITRE ATT&CK. And in this case, we executed 2 ways, double-clicking an EXE and run DLL32. Run DLL32 is both execution and defense evasion. User execution is just execution. You're not really trying to evade anything by clicking a binary. Then we set up command and control via HTTPS. And with a command shell, we then ran who am I? So these are very, very basic, but you see there's actually 5 different things that we did here. So we used a tool called Vector. It's a free tool available at vector.io. And we use that for tracking our engagements. It's a tool strictly for tracking and reporting. It does not emulate anything. It doesn't actually run any of these. Instead, what we have is Scythe integration. So when we execute this on any system, we can actually just send those results to Vector and get a screen like the one you see. In this case, you then only have to focus on the detection part, which is great because we already did the offensive part. Everyone already saw that part. Now let's focus on detection. So we click on each of these and say, okay, did running who am I? Was that logged anywhere? No. Wasn't logged anywhere? Nope. What about command and control over HTTPS? Well, it was like there is an outbound connection that you can see, but there were no alerts. There was no actual log or any detection around it. Same with execution. And as you can see here, nothing was detected. This was our week 1 baseline. Again, once you do all this, you have these excellent little scorecards that you can create here within Vector. And in this case, it's 100% not detected, right? 0% detection rate. So we knew we had a lot of work ahead of us, right? And again, all this is assumed breach. So what did we implement? Well, the first thing we said is, let's do Sysmon. And if you haven't heard of Sysmon, you definitely should, especially on the blue team side. It's short for System Monitor. It was created by Microsoft, really Mark Rosanovic and sysinternals, now part of Microsoft, right? So it's a Windows system service and device driver. It's signed by Microsoft. And you install it on various systems, or as meant all systems if you can, and it remains resident on there through reboots. And what it does is it logs more information than your standard Windows event log and provides a number of different bits of information based on the configuration you give it. So it can determine, for example, when a new process is created, when a process calls out to the internet or to a network connection, if a file is created, if the registry is modified, right? All of these things. So we started very basic. Let's enable Sysmon Event ID 1, process create, to detect the execution of run DLL32, command.exe, and who am I, right? And those 5 TTPs we talked about, we actually executed 3 different things. And we could turn that on. We can turn that on locally. And then we can send that to the SIM, Event Sentry, and then focus on the SIM so that any system that's sending this log will then go through this rules and logic to then alert. And in this case, alerts would go in through email. So we configured that. So let's dive into this a little bit. This is Sysmon. So Sysmon allows, Event ID 1 allows the detection of process creations. In this case, we ran who am I? And you can see there what user executed this from, the current directory they executed this from. So how often does someone execute who am I from the downloads directory, right? Things like that will allow you to identify this. You can also see the parent image. In this case, it's run DLL32. Why would anyone that's on the run DLL32 process run who am I? Right? Those kind of things pop out at you, but of course they pop out at you because now you're logging and detecting this, right? Prior to that, this was not logged at all. So big shout out to Event Sentry. They're a small company. They have a hybrid SIM that has native Active Directory and NetFlow monitoring, which was great for us. It allows for real-time log analysis. So you send the logs to this system called Event Sentry, has an alerting engine, has the ability to detect things like lateral movement, has some automatic remediation, has Sysmon integration, and reveals and secure OS and application settings. So a little bit of configuration management, as well as verifying services, drivers, tasks, etc. So we were very lucky that this is what was being used in this particular environment, because we didn't have to bring in a SIM and create all that, right? And there's ways to do this for free, right? There's Elastic Stack, right, or Elk. There's Splunk, although you'd probably get past the free limit of data. But this really helped us out. It really had the infrastructure there to focus on detection. Excuse me. So once we had detection, we can create alerting. This is an example alert. Again, in this organization, the logic happened by Event Sentry. Then it was sent via email as an alert to then be actioned by the team. So at the end of the first week, we were in a much better shape. We had created detections for Who Am I, user execution, run DLL32, and command.exe, while not having any detection for C2, right? And as Bryson mentioned earlier, the whole goal here is not to get to 100%. I don't think anyone will get to 100% because these adversary behaviors change. And there's just a ton of things that you can do, right? I counted the other day, MITRE ATT&CK has 525 techniques and sub-techniques. So it's not bingo, as Bryson says. But this looks way better, right? We have 80% detection right now at the end of week 1. So we show some progress, and then we can jump into the next week of actually emulating adversary behaviors. So week 2, we took a look at APT19. This is a low sophistication threat actor from China that has gone into and attacked a number of industries, mostly in the US, and has been pretty successful. So for each of these, we're going to define the objectives, understand their objectives. In this case, they focus really on gaining C2 and using that for future attacks. We then break down. This is the analysis, doing the analysis and the organization of this threat actor. We look at their initial access, what they do for execution, what they do for discovery, and collection. So again, a nicer view here that maps to MITRE ATT&CK at a high level, along with individual techniques for each of the things we were going to run. So you can see here, C2 via HTTPS. Some of these will be repeat as we go because attackers do some of the same things over and over. But we always try to go more sophisticated and focus on the net news. So our baseline here, 11 new unique TTPs and no detection on any of these. So we went back to work. We focused on Sysmon again, particularly because they were doing a lot of process creates, using things like ipconfig that creates a new process or a child process, netstat, directory listings, net shares, net views. All of these can be alerted and turned on with Sysmon, event ID 1. Then we looked into some command and control activities. In this particular environment, there was no NetFlow data. So even though Event Sentry has the ability to, and the module to do that, that was not enabled. And that costs a little more. So we had to try to figure out to get command and control activities through Sysmon. So only at the endpoint level. And there is Event ID 3, which is network connections. So in this case, we can actually add those IOCs. This is where the indicators of compromise came in. Known IOCs for this threat actor, we can actually add an alert in the event that any communication is made to that. So while it doesn't detect the C2 to any IP, at least it detects C2 to malicious addresses and domains. We also looked into file create. This is event ID 11. So on the endpoint, if a new file is created, this is generally the case when the command and control framework uses various droppers. There's stage 0, stage 1, stage 2 droppers. So based on that, we were able to determine a new file being created. And here's where we came up with our first big one that I think everyone has worked on, and that is detecting Powershell.exe. So Powershell.exe is a new process. So you might think, all right, system event ID, Sysmon event ID 1, process create, tag everything that has Powershell.exe, and we're good, right? Only if you don't use PowerShell. So we asked, and this was again on day 1 of week 2, hey, do you all use PowerShell? And the answer is, I don't think so. No. Do we use PowerShell? No, I don't think we use PowerShell in our environment. Awesome. It's not the first time I hear that. So let's go ahead and turn on alerting for Sysmon event ID 1. Anytime PowerShell.exe is run, let's get an alert so that we know, since it's not used, it's obviously something out of the ordinary. And within the first few minutes and hours, we were getting hundreds of alerts. And that's because everyone uses PowerShell. They just don't know it. So we realized what it was. We were getting alerts, so we could actually target and figure out exactly what solution was using PowerShell.exe and tune out that particular alert, right? So again, tuning. So this required testing. This is probably the one that required the most testing. So just a quick dive into how Scythe does this. You create these steps, and these steps are packaged into a binary. You double click that binary, and it does the adversary behavior, and then it shuts down. So every time you wanted to run and test for this, you just double click the binary. So in this case, it would establish the HTTPS channel, establish the loader and the controller. This is just basic dropper information that has to get done first. Then it would load some modules into memory, and then it would run PowerShell.exe with who am I, and PowerShell.exe with execution bypass and encoding for who am I, right? You don't have to basic C4 decode that in your head, although if you did, that's awesome. And then shut down. So when I mentioned we run this multiple times, we ran this multiple times, right? First was to detect locally. Sysmon event ID 1 was triggering, but nothing much was happening on PowerShell. You had to manually find it through all this, through all the logs that were coming in. So then we had to send that particular log over to Event Sentry. Then we ran it and realized that there were hundreds of these alerts. So then we had to tune them. We had to say, okay, this one is a valid solution. Do not alert, but still detect, because, it's good information to have if that process gets compromised or something. And then only alert when something bad comes. So we went through this, and as you can see, we ran it 8 different times just to get that one TTP, right? That PowerShell execution TTP detected, right? So now you have an idea as how we went through week over week. So after the second week, we had 73% detection, right? Again, we're never going to get to 100. So if you are expecting a full green circle, lower your expectations. That's not going to happen. Week 3, a little more sophisticated threat actor. In this case, it is a Russian group known as Bloodhound. These go after mostly financial gain, and they use different command and control channels. You can see here things like DNS and RDP. And of course, we're all living this COVID life, so we know RDP has been enabled in a number of places. So let's take a look at that, and let's look at things like persistence and credential access and whatnot. So again, here's a nicer view of this. You see we do command and control, a lot of new TTPs there, DNS, RDP, still some discovery, just because most threat actors, when they get in, they're going to do discovery, and then some collection. So command and control channels. Most adversaries use HTTP and HTTPS. That's the most common. If you want to detect something, probably focus on that. But at the same time, you don't want to let all these other protocols outbound if they shouldn't. Things like DNS, domain name service, right? How you go from google.com to an IP address. Or remote desktop protocol. Generally, you want that to VPN into an environment and then RDP within that environment. You don't want to RDP out. You don't want to RDP into an internal network. And we use the tool here, and shout out to Mubix. This is let me out of your net, right? And of course, there's the actual URL, right? So let me out of your net. And this is a Python script that tests for multiple egress ports. This was actually one of the first modules that was created for Scythe and is available on the marketplace. So if you are a Scythe user, you can get this on the marketplace and do the testing all from within Scythe. So our baseline here, we had our first blocked TTP, and that was outbound DNS. They had a split DNS configuration, which worked very well. Didn't allow us to do command and control through DNS. So what did we have to implement here? Well, first of all, we found that RDP was allowed outbound anywhere. This was big. Why would you allow RDP outbound to anywhere? Immediately, the spectators and the folks at NMFTA realized that this should not be the case. This must have been a configuration error that got changed at some point. And they immediately fixed this. They fixed this in a couple of minutes. It was probably one of the quickest fix I've seen, along with another one I saw in this engagement. Then again, focus on command and control, right? What is allowed outbound? What's allowed out through proxies? What happens if there's HTTPS exfiltration? And then those things like screen print, key logging, and clipboard reading is very hard because they do that through the Windows API. And that's how most malicious actors do it. That's how we implement it in Scythe. So it's very difficult. Do want to mention, though, that clipboard monitoring came out while we were doing this engagement. So a new version of Sysmon was released, but it's extremely noisy. So do want to mention that and caveat that there is a Sysmon detection now for clipboard changes, but it's very noisy, and I've yet to see someone deploy that correctly. So if you have, definitely let us know. We'd love to share that information. So at the end of week 3, we had way more detection, 60% detection. We had some blocked items, right? That RDP and DNS, and then some that were not detected. Jumping over to week 4, APT33. This is our Iranian group. This one targeting their particular vertical, mounting supply chain attacks, and about medium sophistication, if I were to judge it. Many organizations in the US were very worried about this threat actor and some other Iranian threat actors after the January assassination of Soleimani. So this is definitely one that you'll hear quite a bit about, as well as APT34. So we wanted to get this coverage. So this particular threat actor has a lot of TTPs. As you can see there, you can't even see all the TTPs we did because there's a lot of them. But you can see things around execution, around defense evasion, etc. And here's where we had our first detections. When we created the scheduled task, the team at NMFTA got alerts on their phone that new scheduled tasks were being created, and they were able to respond to it. And this was excellent. It was our first time that we were able to measure the response and how quickly from the scheduled task being created to them seeing it and being able to action it, right? Because we're not just testing technology. We also want to train and improve the people in the process. So in this case, 24 unique TTPs, 13% detected and responded to, and 88% not detected. So lots of work this week as well. Again, back to event ID 1, PowerShell and command.exe executing other items, but then focusing on things like file creation. This particular threat actor drops and really they used Empire. So Empire is an open source command control framework that has various stagers, which drops things on your environment and creates new files. If you execute an Empire payload, you will see file creation. So being able to determine that, and then registry modification. So this was probably the biggest one this week based on tuning, because how often do you think you create new registry objects? How often is a registry modified and a different value set? What about a key, right? So our focus here was around persistence, because that's what the goal and the objective of APT33 was. What can we do there? In this case, look at scheduled tasks and run on startup. So in the registry, you can, in the Sysmon, you can enable registry checks, event ID 12, 13, and 14, but extremely noisy. So we had to really tune this to only alert when a registry was modified under the startup activities, under stored credentials, or accessibility features for things like input capture. And at the end of week 4, we had 58% detection. Week 5, APT3, a little more sophisticated Chinese threat actor, seen quite a bit. MITRE ATT&CK actually has an adversary emulation. What's it called? Evaluation. They have MITRE does evaluations on EDRs. The first one was on APT3. So this is a well-known threat actor with a nice plan already created. This is what it looks like in Vector, and 0% detection. So again, back to work on our baseline here, enabling things like creating remote threads. So when something executes and runs run DLL32 and is bringing in new DLLs, file creations for a number of various files here, particularly when you're doing things like persistence, you're touching disk. And that is a big opportunity to catch the malicious actors, as well as adding more IO seats. So at the end of week 5, we had 71% detection. Week 6, we left as free play. This was to use everything we learned in the prior 5 weeks and focus on where we thought there would be gaps. So around this time, there was a Windows domain control critical vulnerability known as zero login. This was being publicly exploited in the wild. There was a Microsoft Exchange vulnerability being exploited in the wild. And we want to test for things like domain discovery and lateral movement. So one of the things we ran is called Bloodhound. If you haven't heard of Bloodhound, you should definitely check it out. This tool can be used by red teamers, blue teamers, or system admins. You run what's called SharpHound. You run that inside of a domain environment. All you need is an authenticated user. So any user in the environment should be able to run this. And it sends a large amount of LDAP queries to the domain controller. It also sends queries and connects to all the workstations and the servers to determine who's logged in, who has RDP privileges, etc. And what we found is that there was no detection for this. Nothing bad occurred because it's literally just querying things to then bring it offline and look at it through Bloodhound. Also, great project, and shout out to the folks that created this one. But there was no detection. So that detection had to be enabled on the domain controller level, which we did not have access to. However, they were able to enable this. And then by running Bloodhound on our own machine, we found that there were a couple of users that were in the enterprise admin group that should not have been there. This rendered a phone call, an immediate phone call to our point of contact, because on free play week, they weren't watching the entire week. We were doing a lot of stuff. And it was resolved in minutes. This is probably a second big finding I've seen that has been fixed so quickly. Then we looked at some vulnerabilities, Microsoft Exchange and that domain credential one called zero login. We looked at this. The systems were not vulnerable. Over the 6-week period, we were able to confirm that they followed their patch management policy and processes. Lateral movement was also something they had invested in quite a bit due to their previous pen tests and red team engagements. So we tried it, and we tried with different tools like PSXAC, PowerShell remoting, Empire, and Scythe. All of them were blocked in various areas. We then looked at Kerberosing. Now, Kerberosing is a technique discovered by Tim Medine of Red Siege, and what it does is it takes advantage of how Kerberos works. You are an authenticated user. You talk to the domain controller, you get what's called a ticket granting ticket. With that ticket, you can then ask for tickets to other services. So you query the domain controller again and say, hey, I want to log into these services. And you tell it, I want to log into all services. And what the domain controller does is it sells you the service principal names and the encrypted ticket. You take those tickets offline and you crack them with Hashcat. We found one particular account that was Kerberostable. We won't mention the vendor, but it was a security product, so we did find that ironic. This is another marketplace item that we have in Scythe, by the way. Tim Medine, the creator, created the module for Scythe, so straight within Scythe, you can do Kerberosing, did not have to use any other tool. Then we did things like port scanning. This, again, just low-hanging fruit of what happens when someone gets in an environment. This one was funny. I got a text message during that week by Urban like, hey, what are y'all scanning for? Of course, he knew what we were scanning for, but just the notification that from the time we ran the scan to the time they got the alert and they actioned it, in this case, calling us out, was good, was acceptable and very quick. Lastly, we did exfiltration. We exfiltrated 2 gigs. One of the ways that Scythe does this is we create files right before we exfiltrate them. That way we're not exfiltrating real data. And in this case, there was no visibility. And one of the recommendations that we had was to enable this net flow data. So the end state here was $0 technology spend. We achieved a 64% detection rate by using things like Sysmon and Event Sentry, and reached the conclusion that an adversary would be caught if they went through these particular behaviors that they're known to use. Using Vector, we are also able to create this historical trend. Now, why does it go down every week? That's because every week we baseline with the system how we found it before we started. So most of our baselines went down to 0%, sometimes 13%. But at the end, you can see we had a much higher detection rate, always improving, and seeing the line of once we start getting to more sophisticated actors, it was standing at a very regular percentage of detection. So to wrap up, our recommendations here are to continue testing. We saw 2 instances in this 6-week period where configurations were changed without their knowledge to something it shouldn't be. You can continually test. We left them with all these executables. Anytime they want to emulate any of those adversaries, they double click the binary and it goes and does its behaviors. So the other recommendation was network level detection. In this case, it would require an upgrade of their Event Sentry for that NetFlow data. However, we got them to a nice percentage without that. And then increase the sophistication level. Threats are evolving, right? Adversaries are evolving all the time. So this is one of the reasons why we give back to the community. We will take and see a new attack. The latest one is Ryuk, which targeted our hospitals. We looked at that attack. We worked with industry experts, learned those behaviors, created the plan, and shared that plan with everyone so that they can test themselves. And again, sharing with the community is extremely important for us here at Scythe. It is for NMFTA and Event Sentry. So all of us are sharing and giving all this back to the community. As far as a framework to take this and build your own Purple Team program, you have the Purple Team Exercise Framework. It's free at scythe.io/PTEF. The largest adversary emulation plan, our library, is free and available on GitHub. There's the link. You can read through that and create your own adversary emulation plans and share them back with the community. Do submit PRs. We love those. Then Sysmon. We use the Sysmon configuration, in particular one by Olaf Hartong. He works at a company called Falcon Force. Definitely check them out. They're a managed detection and response organization. And again, all the Sysmon configurations are out and available for you to modify them in Olaf's GitHub. And lastly, all the alerts and logic that was created for NMFTA in Event Sentry is being shared through a series of blog posts on Event Sentry. So if you use Event Sentry, you can take all the work we've done and leverage it and have a nice starting point. So with that, I think we are at our time. I want to thank you all for that. I think we're right on time. We have maybe 2 minutes left. But appreciate your time. And if there's any questions, we will take them on Discord.